The September 11th survivor story that stays with me. Of the last 25 people who made it out of the World Trade Center's South Tower, on September 11th, 2001, Florence Jones was number 18. Her story is one that I have always carried with me. September 11th, 2001 was a beautiful morning until it wasn't. Like so many, Florence has long described the clear blue skies and the kindness on full display. That morning was like so many others, until she says it descended into hell on earth. Florence worked as a manager on the 77th floor of the South Tower. The North Tower was hit first, and she remembers going up to the 78th floor to tell colleagues that they should leave. She went back down the escalator to the 77th floor, and moments later, the second plane hit, just one floor above her. Many of the colleagues she had just seen were now gone, including Jill, a young mother. Florence has always said she will never forget Jill's smile, especially the day Jill brought her baby boy Jake to the office. When the second plane hit, Florence had to find her own way to escape. She joined a small group of colleagues and started down the smoke-filled stairwell, holding hands, holding each other's shirts, guiding one another. She remembers her boss, fearing Florence might fall on her way down, suggesting she take her shoes off. He carried her shoes the rest of the way down. They helped each other out. For years, those debris-covered shoes sat in a box under her bed. Now they're in the 9/11 museum. Florence survived the attack on the Twin Towers, and ever since has conveyed a quiet sense of purpose, a sense of responsibility, after having survived that dark day. She has shared so many deeply personal reflections. For one, she will never forget looking out and seeing men and women in the North Tower standing at the window's edge after the first plane hit. To see these young people doing the sign of the cross and jumping, you're like, oh my God, she told me. It remains one of her most painful memories of that day. Florence has always said she didn't look away out of sheer dignity for those who had no choice. She believed someone needed to bear witness to their suffering. To this day, she says they were among the true heroes of that day. 10 years ago, she took me along on what used to be her walk to work, past the fire station where she would always wave to the firefighters standing in the doorway. Florence had not been inside Ground Zero until she went with us then. The giant craters left from the towers were now reflecting pools. As we approached the pools, Florence put her hand to her face, and we knew. It all came flooding back. The loved ones, the colleagues, and the faces of those brave men and women who never made it out. Etched in bronze at the pool's edge, among the thousands of names, was her friend Jill. Recently, 20 years after 9/11, Florence received a phone call from Jill's son, Jake, who is now nearly 20 years old, asked her if she could remember anything she remembered about his mom. Florence told him her smile, her kindness, and her one true joy, being a mother. She told Jake that she remembers that she had never seen his mother happier than that day she brought him to the office all those years ago. Then, having learned of Jake's own life, he's now a student at the University of Michigan. Florence told him that his mother would have been very proud of him. On this 20th anniversary of 9/11, I had the chance to meet Jake. He told me those words from Florence were a gift. Harrowing escape from the World Trade Center's North Tower on September 11th. My name is David Paventi. I was sitting on the 81st floor of the North Tower on September 11, 2001. The first hijacked plane struck the 93rd floor. I had arrived in New York City a day earlier for business meetings. I remembered it was a foggy day, and I got to the office and immediately walked over to the windows and stepped up onto the heat register to look out and couldn't see a thing. A colleague of mine who was a little paranoid immediately said, "What are you doing? That gives me the creeps." Then very offhandedly, "How do airplanes not hit this building?" My response at the time was, "Seriously? Who even thinks about such a thing?" That conversation took place on September 10th, 2001. The next day at about 8:46 a.m., I was in an interior conference room when I felt the entire building lurch forward and then return back into place. We had offices in San Francisco, so my brain automatically went to earthquake, and I started to get under the table. My coworkers, some of whom had experienced the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, knew better and quickly made their way toward the stairwell. I called my wife on my phone. I said, "I'm fine. I'm leaving the floor now. I'll call you when I get to the bottom." We still really didn't know what had happened. As we made our way toward the stairs, I recall someone yelling in the background that an airplane had hit the building. The assumption was that maybe it was a small plane. At the time, we had no frame of reference for a passenger jet crashing into the building. There was not a lot of traffic on the stairs, which should tell you something about what was happening higher up. I got about to floor 75 and stopped to wait for my longtime colleague Bob, who was making sure our floor had cleared out. The stairwells were narrow, only 2 people wide. At the 65th floor, the traffic slowed to a near stop. We couldn't see anything. It was eerily silent. You expect in New York for it to be loud and boisterous. And it was very, very notably quiet. We would go down a few steps, stop, down a few more steps, stop. That went on for about 45 minutes. At the time, there were no smartphones, but in addition to my flip phone, I had a pager. The pager could send and receive short emails. I had it programmed to give stock-related news. It began to buzz with reports of the stock market openings being delayed because a plane had hit the towers. Then, news came in of a second plane and mentions of terrorist activity. Finally, the pager buzzed and said a 767 aircraft jet had hit the North Tower. Rather than cause further panic in the stairwell, myself and my coworker kept these updates to ourselves. I also began sending emails to my wife. I remember the first one said, "We're on the 56th floor." Those emails became my lifeline that day. The irony is that the pager nearly got left behind in Charlotte. The day before, I had forgotten it on the way to the airport, and my wife and I had made the decision to turn around and go get it. Without that pager and those emails, I don't know how we would have communicated. Myself and my coworker navigated the stairwell. We would stop at each level to feel the doors and see if they were hot. And I would think, would we be better off going to find another stairwell? Is that a better way out? When we arrived at the 30th floor, traffic came to a complete halt. Firefighters rushed towards the danger. We began to see firefighters making their way up the stairs, carrying enormous hose and equipment. These brave men and women assured everyone that the stairwell was open at the bottom, and to just keep going. I will never forget this one fireman. He stopped and put his hose on the ground and hunched over to catch his breath and made the comment, "I get to do all this for $30,000 a year." And then he picked the hose back up and kept going. It was a real gut check. Back in Charlotte, my wife got a call from her mother-in-law. She said, "I know he is in New York. Do you know where he is? Is he okay?" And I had to tell her that he was in the World Trade Center, she said. I think that was probably the hardest thing I had to do that day. Now, being a mom, it's hard to tell a mom that their son is in the building that they are watching on TV that's engulfed in flames, she said. When my coworker and I ultimately made it to the lower level, it was lit by emergency lighting. It was looking like a scene out of the movie Die Hard. All the windows had blown out. It smelled of gas, and the sprinklers must have been on. It looked like a bomb had gone off, and I remembered walking down an escalator and getting out of the building through a shattered window. Once we were out of the courtyard, a policewoman began screaming at us all to run. "Get away from the building and don't look back." That's when we took off. About 3 blocks down, I saw Bob round a corner and tuck behind a building. He had been on my phone with his wife. I followed him, and just as we did that, an enormous white cloud came rushing down the street. What was remarkable to me in that moment was that neither of us really got dirty. You see all these pictures of people who were there that day, covered in dust from head to toe. You can see their eyes, and that's about it. We were in the courtyard when the building started to fall, and 3 blocks away when it came down completely, and yet all we had on us was just a little dust. I still have the shirt I was wearing that day, along with my World Trade Center visitor's badge, dated September 11th, 2001, with my photo on it. In a state of disbelief, Bob, my coworker, and I had a singular goal: to get off the island of Manhattan and onto the mainland. Ultimately, we decided to head to the Queensboro Bridge in an attempt to get to Bob's brother's house on Long Island. I knew there were only 2 ways off Manhattan, a bridge or a tunnel, and I thought at least on a bridge you can jump and have some chance of survival. The inbound lanes of the Queensboro Bridge had been closed to driving traffic, so hundreds of people were walking across the lanes. We started to hear a rumbling noise, and we looked over our shoulder. We watched the North Tower, the tower we had just been in, melting down into the horizon. That's when we took off running. Just nothing made sense. In Charlotte, I had lost contact with my wife. From her perspective, she said, I didn't know which tower he had been in. I didn't know what floor he had been on. My heart just sank. I didn't know where he was, she thought to herself. Although I was hesitant, Bob insisted that our only option once we had crossed the bridge was to hitchhike. A gentleman in a green Dodge Neon kindly pulled over and asked where we were going. He said, I'm not taking you to Long Island. What's your other option? We told him JFK, thinking we could get a rental car. That's when he told us, I'm only doing this because my wife is in the World Trade Center, so I'm hoping if I can help you, someone will help her. It was a sentiment that had stood out to me even to this day. We were just 5 people away from the car rental line when the company ran out of cars. Everyone started bolting for the door. And at that time, the different rental places at JFK were separated by a chain link fence. Bob somehow noticed a hole in the fence, and we ran through it, and because of that managed to be the second people in line at the next rental car agency. Without that hole, we may have not gotten a car. We made it to Long Island, and the next day drove back to our families in Charlotte. Though I've told this story hundreds of times, I still shake my head at how it all unfolded. You take a look at that whole day and just think of everywhere you made a decision, and how with one little change, it could have literally changed everything. What if we had decided to try to find another staircase when we were stopped on the stairs? What if we had stopped running or made a wrong turn in the cloud of debris and something had hit us and killed us? What if we hadn't run over that bridge and met up with the guy in the green Dodge Neon? What if Bob hadn't found that hole in the chain link fence? One different choice and we may not be here. It's hard to sit back and not think there has to be something bigger guiding you through. The story does not end here. A few years after 9/11, I was sitting in Charlotte when my phone rang. It was the New York Police Department sergeant. He said, "Sir, we have found your briefcase." I said, "What do you mean?" "I'm staring at my briefcase here in Charlotte." And he asked, "Were you in downtown New York on 9/11? And I just froze. A few weeks later, I was in New York and went by the precinct's recovery room. I had this travel wallet I used to carry, and there it was. The items were covered in ash and a bit charred, but it still had my passport, my boarding pass, my frequent filer cards, and some coins in it. When you think of all the debris and the destruction that day, the fact that this was still fully intact is just unexplainable. When I opened the portfolio, there was a paper that had been filled out and placed inside that said, "Assumed DOA." That was a humbling moment. 20 years later, Bob and I remained friends and colleagues, working together in Charlotte. My wife and I have a 16-year-old son, Zach, who has grown up hearing his dad's stories. He was 6 years old when he realized the significance of it. Here's what he tells the reports. It was a 10-year anniversary, and I was sitting in the office listening to my dad tell his story, and I remember thinking, if anything had happened to my dad, I wouldn't be here. My mom would have a different life. Everything would just be different than it is now, Zach said.